Two racists decide to attack an elderly woman, thinking she's an easy victim. What they don't know is that her rescued dog is an ex-cop. This night will change everything. Will the loyal friend be able to protect his mistress? Ruby Williams had lived on the outskirts of Chicago for nearly 40 years. Her small, weathered home nestled among a patchwork of neighbors who had come and gone. The neighborhood had changed over the decades, and though she'd seen the gradual ebb and flow of people, she'd always remained a fixture. Her life was simple, steady, a quiet rhythm marked by morning routines, warm greetings, and the companionship of her dog, Duke. Duke wasn't just any dog. He was a hulking German shepherd with silver-tinged fur that betrayed his age. Ruby had rescued him from a shelter 5 years ago, drawn to the intelligence in his amber eyes and the unshakable calmness in his demeanor. To Ruby, he wasn't just a pet. He was family. They shared everything. The morning walks, the small meals Ruby prepared with care, and the stillness of evenings on her creaky front porch. It was on one of those morning walks that Ruby's sense of peace began to shift. The autumn air was crisp, the sun casting a pale gold light over the cracked sidewalks and aging homes. Duke trotted beside her, his gait measured and purposeful. Ruby carried a small cloth bag for bread, a ritual she cherished, stopping by the local bakery to chat with Mrs. Alvarez, whose warm rolls were as comforting as her conversations. As they rounded the corner, Ruby noticed two men leaning against a car across the street. One of them, a wiry man with unkempt hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips, nudged the other, a stockier figure with a shaved head. They were watching her. Ruby's steps faltered just slightly, her grip tightening on Duke's leash. He noticed it too. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Easy now, Duke," Ruby murmured, giving his neck a reassuring pat, but her eyes lingered on the men, their sharp stares and murmured words unsettling her. She quickened her pace, and Duke matched her stride, his gaze flicking back to the figures until they were out of sight. At the bakery, Mrs. Alvarez greeted her with a cheery smile, oblivious to Ruby's unease. The familiar warmth of the shop should have soothed her, but she couldn't shake the tension that had settled in her chest. Even as she exchanged pleasantries, her thoughts kept circling back to the men on the corner. On the way home, Ruby glanced over her shoulder more than once. The streets felt quieter than usual, the rustle of leaves too loud. Duke stayed close, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced with something sharper, more alert. Ruby forced herself to take a deep breath. She was being silly, letting her imagination run wild. This was her neighborhood. She'd walked these streets for years without fear. But later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across her yard, Ruby found herself checking the locks on her doors. Duke sat by the window, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the darkening street. Ruby watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "Duke, you're making me nervous," she said with a soft chuckle, though her voice wavered. He didn't respond, his attention unwavering. Ruby shook her head and retreated to the kitchen, convincing herself it was nothing. Yet, as she washed the dishes from her modest supper, she caught herself glancing toward the window more often than she'd like to admit. The next morning, Ruby resolved to shake off the unease. Life was too short to waste on unfounded fears. She donned her coat and hat, Duke wagging his tail as she clipped on his leash. They stepped out into the brisk morning air, and for a while, everything felt normal. But as they neared the corner where she'd seen the men the day before, her steps slowed. The car was gone. the street empty save for the occasional jogger or cyclist. Ruby let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Duke, however, was still on edge. His ears flicked at every sound, his nose twitching as if searching for something Ruby couldn't see. She gave his leash a gentle tug. "Come on, boy, let's not borrow trouble." The bakery was its usual lively self, the smell of fresh bread wafting out to meet them as they approached. Mrs. Alvarez handed Ruby her usual loaf with a kind smile and asked about her children, her questions always tinged with genuine curiosity. Ruby answered politely, but kept the conversation brief. Her unease was returning, a gnawing sense that something wasn't quite right. On the walk back, Ruby noticed Duke stopping more frequently, his head swiveling as if to track an unseen presence. When they reached her gate, she glanced over her shoulder one last time, her heart skipping when she thought she saw movement near the corner of the street. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. That night, Ruby couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of her old house and the faint rustling of leaves outside. Duke was a silhouette in the doorway, his broad frame backlit by the moonlight streaming through the hall window. He was watching, waiting. Ruby sat up, her chest tight with worry. She told herself it was just the wind, the normal noises of the night amplified by her anxiety. But deep down, she knew better. Duke wasn't a skittish dog. If he was on edge, there was a reason. When morning came, Ruby felt a heaviness settle over her as she stepped out onto the porch. The neighborhood looked the same, bathed in the soft glow of sunrise, but it felt different. She glanced at Duke, who was sitting by her side, his eyes scanning the street. He didn't look at her when she spoke. "What do you see, Duke?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "What is it that's got you so worked up?" He didn't answer, of course, but the growl that rumbled low in his throat sent a chill down Ruby's spine. The soft glow of morning sun had already started to fill the corners of Ruby's small, tidy house, casting a golden light over her living room. Duke lay on the floor beside the window, his gaze fixed on the quiet street outside. Though his eyes seemed to be watching the neighborhood, they were far away, drawn into memories of another life. His chest rose and fell with slow breaths, but his ears twitched at every distant noise. He could hear the subtle movements in the street, footsteps, the faint rumble of a car, the sound of wind moving through the brittle autumn leaves. Every sound brought with it a faint echo of the past. Once upon a time, Duke had been something more than just a family dog. Before he became Ruby's faithful companion, Duke had a job, a purpose. He was a police dog, an officer with duties as important as any human member of the force. His days had been filled with training exercises, patrols, and moments of intense action. He could still remember the weight of his old life, the adrenaline that coursed through his veins when he detected danger. He remembered the scent of fear, the commands shouted by his handler, the way he would spring into action without hesitation. It had been during one of those long nights on a routine patrol that everything had changed. Duke had been riding in the back of a police car, his handler, Officer Sean Miller, in the driver's seat. They were patrolling a quiet area much like Ruby's neighborhood, streets lined with old houses, their windows dim and the sidewalks empty. There had been nothing unusual until suddenly a call came through the radio. Robbery in progress. An armed suspect on the run. The excitement of a pursuit had filled the car, and Duke could sense it all in the tension in Miller's voice, the way his heartbeat quickened. They arrived at the scene, a narrow alley where the suspect had been cornered. Duke could still recall the scents, the metallic tang of the gun, the pungent sweat of the suspect, and the calm determination of Officer Miller. The suspect had turned, knife in hand, and everything had happened in a blur. Duke was unleashed, moving fast and low, his focus solely on disarming the threat. He could hear Miller's shouts, see the knife glinting in the dim light. He lunged, sinking his teeth into the suspect's arm just as the man swung toward Miller. He'd protected his handler, saved his life, but it had come at a cost. The suspect's knife had found its mark, slicing deep into Duke's hind leg. The pain was searing, almost blinding, but Duke hadn't let go. He had clamped down until the suspect was disarmed and subdued. The memory of Miller's voice calling his name, his hands stroking Duke's fur, telling him it was going to be okay, was still vivid. The next few days were a haze of hospital smells, bright lights, and pain. The department had been proud of him, hailed him as a hero, but the injury had left him permanently weakened. He wasn't fit for active duty anymore. Duke had been retired, placed in a shelter meant for old police dogs. It was a place filled with echoes of what once was. Too many dogs, too few people willing to take in aging heroes. Duke remembered the days spent there, the uncertainty, the strange quiet that seemed to fill the kennels. The handlers came by to feed and clean, but the warmth was gone. He had spent his days lying on the cold floor, staring at the bars, unsure of what would come next. It was then that Ruby had come into his life. He still remembered the day he first saw her, standing at the door of the shelter, her eyes scanning the room until they met his. She had been different from the others who had passed by. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no dismissive glance. Instead, there had been understanding, a warmth that reached out to him. She had approached his kennel, crouching down and speaking softly, her voice carrying kindness and something else, something that made Duke's chest feel lighter. "You look like you've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" she had said, her hand reaching out to touch the bars of the cage. Duke had moved closer, his nose pressing against her hand, and in that moment he had known. She had seen something in him worth saving, and he in turn saw in her the promise of a new beginning. When she took him home that day, Duke had decided that this would be his new purpose, protecting Ruby, just as he once protected his partner. Back in the present, Duke shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he watched a shadow move across the street. The street was empty, the houses quiet, but something was wrong. Duke could feel it, that same sense of unease that had never failed him before. It wasn't just the men from yesterday, it was something deeper, an instinct telling him danger was close. Ruby came into the living room, her footsteps soft on the worn wooden floor. She smiled when she saw Duke lying there, his eyes fixed on the window. She had always found comfort in his vigilance, a sense of security that let her sleep peacefully at night. But today there was a look in his eyes that gave her pause. It wasn't just his usual alertness. There was something else, a tension that seemed to pulse through his whole body. "Still keeping watch, huh, boy?" she said, her voice gentle as she walked over and knelt beside him. She rubbed his neck, feeling the stiffness of his muscles, the way his gaze never wavered from the street. Ruby sighed, her hand lingering on his fur. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but you've got me on edge too, you know that?" Duke finally turned his head to look at her, his eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment, Ruby saw something in them, something fierce, something that reminded her of stories she had heard about police dogs, their loyalty and bravery. She had always wondered about Duke's past. The shelter hadn't told her much, just that he was a retired working dog. She had never pressed for more details, content to let Duke be Duke, her friend, her companion. Ruby stood up, giving Duke one last scratch behind the ears before moving to the kitchen. She needed to distract herself to focus on something else. She put on a kettle for tea, her mind drifting back to the past few days. The men on the street, Duke's strange behavior, the way the air seemed to carry a tension she couldn't shake. She shook her head, trying to dispel the worry that had taken root in her chest. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Duke's behavior remained unchanged. He followed Ruby from room to room, always staying close, his eyes darting to the windows whenever there was the faintest noise outside. Ruby tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that everything was fine, but Duke's tension was infectious. As evening settled in, Ruby went about her usual routine, cooking a simple dinner, tidying up the kitchen, and settling in her old armchair with a book. Duke lay by her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were still watchful, his ears perked. The house was quiet, the only sounds the occasional creak of the floorboards or the rustle of leaves outside. Ruby looked down at Duke, her heart aching with a mix of love and worry. She reached out, her fingers brushing his fur, and Duke lifted his head to look at her. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know, I don't know what I'd do without you," she said softly. Duke blinked, his gaze steady, as if to say that he wasn't going anywhere. Ruby sighed, her hand lingering on his head. "I just wish I knew what was bothering you." The hours ticked by, the darkness outside deepening, and Ruby finally decided it was time for bed. She double-checked the locks on the doors, her fingers lingering on the deadbolt as a shiver ran down her spine. Duke followed her to the bedroom, his nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. He settled in the hallway, his body positioned so that he could see the front door. Ruby lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about calling her son, maybe asking if he could come by for a few days, but she dismissed the idea just as quickly. He had his own life, his own worries. She didn't want to be a burden. Eventually, sleep took her, but it was restless, filled with vague, unsettling dreams. Duke remained awake, his eyes open, ears flicking at every sound. He knew the feeling in the air. It was the same as before, back when he had been on duty. The calm before the storm, the quiet that always preceded danger. And he knew, deep down, that the danger wasn't over. The night had grown quiet, the sort of silence that often fell over Ruby's neighborhood as midnight approached. The distant hum of traffic from the main road had died down, and only the soft rustling of the wind through the trees remained. Ruby was already in bed, her room bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight that filtered in through the curtains. Duke lay in the hallway, positioned as always, so he could see both the front door and Ruby's room. He hadn't slept at all. Something gnawed at his instincts, something primal and ancient that told him danger was near. He listened to the creaks of the old house, the gentle thumps as it settled in the cool night air. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. His eyes, focused and unblinking, kept watch over the front door. And then it came, a sound that didn't belong. A faint shuffle, almost imperceptible, coming from outside. Duke's ears perked, his nostrils flaring as he caught a whiff of something strange. His eyes narrowed, and a low growl began to rumble in his throat. It was deep, almost a vibration, a warning that something, or someone, was near. Ruby stirred in her bed, the noise penetrating her sleep just enough to pull her from her dreams. She opened her eyes, disoriented, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't immediately understand. The sound reached her again, a soft scraping, like metal against metal. Ruby sat up, her pulse quickening as she listened. Duke was already on his feet, his growl growing louder. She threw off the blanket, her bare feet touching the cold floor. She moved to the hallway, her body tensed with anxiety. She could hear Duke's growl now, deep and menacing, his body rigid as he stared at the front door. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound. It was the sound Duke made when something was very, very wrong. Slowly, she approached the dog, her eyes wide with fear. She placed a hand on his back, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way he seemed ready to spring forward at any moment. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her heart pounding in her chest. But she didn't have to wait long for an answer. A loud clank echoed through the quiet of the house. Someone was at the front door, trying to get inside. Ruby felt a surge of panic rise within her. Her throat tightened, her breath caught. She could see the door handle jiggling, the metal shaking as someone on the other side tried to force it open. And then, with a crash, the door was kicked open. The lock splintered, the sound reverberating through the house. Ruby screamed, stumbling back, her eyes wide with terror as two men burst into her living room. They wore dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by hoodies. The one in front, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked as he looked at Ruby. "Stay quiet, lady," he snarled, his voice rough. He brandished a small crowbar, his eyes gleaming with malice. Behind him, his accomplice, a larger man with a shaved head, stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over the room. Ruby backed away, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She felt herself hitting the wall, nowhere else to go, her heart pounding as she looked at the intruders. But Duke didn't hesitate. With a snarl that seemed to shake the walls, he lunged forward, his powerful legs propelling him straight at the intruders. His jaws snapped shut around the arm of the man with the crowbar, his teeth sinking in deep. The man screamed, the crowbar falling from his hand as Duke dragged him down to the ground. "Get him off me," the man shouted, his voice high with panic. He tried to pull away, but Duke held on, his growls reverberating through the room. The second man, the larger one, rushed forward, trying to kick Duke off his partner. Duke released his hold just long enough to dodge the kick, his body spinning as he turned his focus on the new threat. He barked, a sharp, ferocious sound that echoed in the small space. The larger man stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. He wasn't prepared for this. They had expected an easy job, an old woman alone in her house. They hadn't expected the dog. Ruby, shaken with fear, watched the chaos unfold in front of her. She could barely process what was happening. The intruders, Duke's attack, the screams and shouts. Her body moved on autopilot, her instincts taken over. She turned, grabbing the phone off the table, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. "Please, someone's breaking into my house," she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking. She gave them her address, her eyes never leaving Duke as he fought the men, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The man Duke had bitten was trying to crawl away, his arm bleeding, his eyes wide with fear. The larger man grabbed a chair, swinging it toward Duke, trying to keep the dog at bay. But Duke was relentless. He dodged the swing, his teeth snapping as he went for the man's leg. His jaws clamped down, and the man howled in pain, dropping the chair and falling to the ground. Ruby could hear the dispatcher on the phone, but the words didn't register. All she could focus on was Duke, her Duke, who was defending her with everything he had. She watched as he held his ground, his body a blur of motion as he kept the intruders at bay. Tears filled her eyes, her heart swelling with both fear and pride. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the chaos, a piercing wail that seemed to bring everything to a halt. The men exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting from anger to fear. They hadn't planned for this. They hadn't expected the dog, and they certainly hadn't expected the police. "Let's get out of here," the larger man shouted, his voice tinged with panic. He shoved his partner, who scrambled to his feet, clutching his injured arm. They turned and bolted for the door, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. Duke lunged after them, but Ruby called out, her voice sharp with fear. "Duke, no!" she cried, her heart in her throat. Duke skidded to a stop, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the retreating figures as they disappeared into the night. He let out a low growl, his chest heaving as he stood in the open doorway, his fur bristling. Ruby rushed to his side, her hands shaken as she grabbed his collar, pulling him back inside. The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights illuminating the front of Ruby's house, the red and blue glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. 2 officers rushed up to the door, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the room. Ruby was standing in the middle of the living room, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but urgent. Ruby nodded, her eyes welling with tears. She looked down at Duke, who stood by her side, his body still tense, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting the men to return. "He saved me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He saved my life." The officer glanced at Duke, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the dog's stance, the way he stood protectively by Ruby's side. He knelt down, his gaze softening as he looked at Duke. "You did good, boy," he said softly, reaching out to pat Duke's head. Duke didn't relax, his eyes still focused on the door, his body still ready to fight if needed. The second officer moved to Ruby, guiding her to sit down on the couch. He spoke in low tones, asking her questions, what had happened, what the men looked like. Ruby answered as best she could, her hands still trembling, her eyes darting to Duke every few moments, as if to reassure herself that he was still there, still protecting her. The officers stayed for a while, securing the broken door and making sure Ruby was safe before they left. One of them handed her a card, his expression serious. "We're going to have patrols in the area for the next few nights, ma'am," he said. "If you see anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call." Ruby nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. She watched as the officers left, the flashing lights of their cars slowly fading into the distance. When they were finally alone, Ruby knelt down beside Duke, her hands gently cupping his face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Oh, Duke, what would I do without you?" she whispered, her heart aching with both fear and love. Duke looked at her, his eyes softening, his body relaxing for the first time that night. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as he let out a deep sigh. Ruby wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, her body shaken with sobs. She knew, deep down, that she owed her life to this dog, to her Duke, who had risked everything to protect her. And, as she held him, she made a silent promise to herself that she would do whatever it took to keep them both safe. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Ruby couldn't sleep, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She stayed on the couch, Duke by her side, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his fur. The house was quiet, the shadows long, but Ruby no longer felt alone. She had Duke, and that was enough. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Ruby finally allowed herself to close her eyes, exhaustion pulling her into a restless sleep. Duke stayed awake, his eyes open, his body still tense. He knew, just as Ruby did, that the danger wasn't over. Not yet. The morning after the attack felt surreal to Ruby. The house was eerily quiet, the broken door a glaring reminder of what had transpired just hours before. She sat on the edge of her couch, her hands still trembling as she cradled a cup of coffee. She felt hollow, the events of the night replaying in her mind over and over again. Duke's growls, the men's shouts, the crash of the door. She glanced down at Duke, who lay beside her feet, and his eyes half closed but his ears still alert. He hadn't rested at all, and she could see the exhaustion in the way his body sagged slightly, his chest rising and falling in deep breaths. Ruby reached down, her fingers gently running through his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved me. You know that?" Duke's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a brief moment his gaze softened. But it was only a moment before his ears twitched and his head turned toward the window, his body tensing once again. Ruby knew what she had to do. She couldn't live like this, always on edge, always wondering if those men were out there, waiting for their next opportunity. She had to make sure that she and Duke were safe. She had to be prepared. The first thing Ruby did was call her son, Nathan. She hadn't wanted to worry him. He lived across the country, and she knew he had his own life to deal with. But she needed to hear his voice, needed the reassurance that only he could give. She dialed his number, her fingers trembling as she pressed the buttons. The phone rang twice before she heard his voice. "Mom, everything okay?" Nathan's voice was groggy, and Ruby realized she'd woken him up. She glanced at the clock. It was early, barely 6 in the morning. "I'm sorry, honey," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to wake you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and she could hear Nathan shifting, his voice filled with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound upset." Ruby took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears. She didn't want to scare him, but she couldn't hide the truth. "Nathan, there was a break-in last night. 2 men broke into the house. Duke saved me." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. She could almost hear Nathan's heart pounding, his breathing quickening. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" His voice was strained, the panic clear. "No, sweetheart, I'm okay," Ruby replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Duke scared them off, and the police came. I just needed to hear your voice." Nathan let out a breath, and she could hear the relief in his exhale. "Mom, I'm coming. I'm getting on a plane today. I'm coming to you." No, you don't need to do that," Ruby protested, shaking her head even though he couldn't see her. "I'll be fine, Nathan, I promise. I've got Duke, and I'm going to make some changes. I'll be okay." But Nathan was adamant. "Mom, I need to be there, just for a few days. Please." Ruby hesitated, her heart swelling at the love in her son's voice. She knew he was worried, and she couldn't deny that part of her wanted nothing more than to have him here, to feel the safety of having her son by her side. She took a deep breath, nodding. "Okay, honey, okay." After she hung up, Ruby sat in silence for a long while, her fingers still gripping the phone. Duke had gotten up, pacing near the door, his eyes darting to the broken frame, the splintered wood a stark reminder of what could have happened. Ruby watched him for a moment, her heart aching. She stood, setting her coffee cup down and walking over to the door. She knelt, her fingers brushing over the broken lock, the splinters scratching against her skin. It was time to take action. Ruby spent the day reinforcing the house. She called a local handyman, a kind older man named Mr. Leonard, who had done work for her in the past. He arrived in his old blue truck, a toolbox in hand, his face filled with concern as he surveyed the damage to her door. "Miss Ruby, I can't believe something like this happened," Mr. Leonard said, shaking his head. "This neighborhood, it used to be so safe." Ruby nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not the same anymore," she said quietly, "but I need to make sure this house is secure. Can you help me?" Mr. Leonard nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Of course I can. I'll get this door fixed up for you, and I'll reinforce the locks. You won't have to worry, Miss Ruby." He worked for hours, replacing the broken door frame, installing new locks, heavy-duty ones that required a key from both sides. He even added a sliding bolt at Ruby's request. When he was finished, he stood back, wiping his brow and giving Ruby a reassuring smile. "There you go, Miss Ruby. This should keep you safe." Ruby smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Leonard. I really appreciate it." But it wasn't just the door. Ruby knew she needed more. She went to the hardware store, buying security cameras, new locks for the windows, and even a small battery-powered alarm that would sound if someone tried to force their way inside. Duke followed her around the house as she worked, his presence a constant comfort. She installed the cameras herself, her hands steady as she screwed the brackets into the walls, the wires trailing down to connect to her old laptop. She tested them once they were in place, watching the live feed of her front porch, the backyard, the side of the house. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the day turned into evening, Ruby felt exhaustion settling over her. She sat on the porch, Duke lying beside her, his head resting on her foot. She looked out at the street. The house is quiet, the lights in the windows casting soft glows onto the sidewalks. She thought about the men, about the way they had looked at her, the hatred in their eyes, the malice in their voices. It hadn't just been about stealing. There had been something else, something deeper, something rooted in who she was, in the color of her skin. Ruby had seen that kind of hatred before. She had grown up with it, learned to recognize it in the way people looked at her, the way they spoke to her. She had always hoped it wouldn't follow her here, to this quiet neighborhood, but it had. Ruby took a deep breath, her hand resting on Duke's head. She couldn't let fear control her. She wouldn't. She had spent too long building this life, this home. She had fought too hard to let it be taken from her. The next few days were a blur of activity. Nathan arrived, his face pale with worry when he saw the reinforced door, the cameras mounted on the corners of the house. He hugged Ruby tightly, his arms strong around her shoulders, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Oh, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Ruby shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm okay, Nathan. I really am. Duke took care of me." Nathan knelt down, scratching Duke behind the ears, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Duke," he said softly. "Thank you for protecting my mom." Duke wagged his tail, his eyes softening as he leaned into Nathan's touch. Nathan stayed with Ruby for a week, helping her with anything she needed, fixing things around the house, setting up more security features, even helping her train Duke with new commands to respond to potential threats. They went over scenarios together, practicing how Ruby could quickly call for help, how she could use the pepper spray Nathan had bought for her. Ruby could feel the anxiety slowly beginning to loosen its grip on her chest. Having Nathan there helped, but it was also the preparations, the sense that she was taking control, that she wasn't going to be a victim. She was determined to be ready, whatever came next. One evening, after Nathan had left, Ruby sat in her living room, the soft glow of the lamps casting warm light over the walls. Duke lay at her feet, his eyes closed, his body finally relaxed. Ruby picked up a photo frame from the table beside her, a picture of her and her late husband, their smiles wide and genuine, taken years ago on a sunny day at the beach. She traced her finger over his face, her heart aching with both love and loss. "I wish you were here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wish you could see how brave our boy is." She set the frame back down, her eyes misting over. She reached down, her fingers running through Duke's fur. He lifted his head, looking at her with those deep, knowing eyes. Ruby smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You and me, Duke," she said softly. "We're going to be okay. We're ready now." Duke blinked, his gaze unwavering, as if he understood. He rested his head back on her lap, letting out a contented sigh. Ruby leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, feeling the weight of the past few days slowly beginning to lift. But even as the days passed and the house became more secure, Ruby knew that the sense of safety was fragile. Duke was still on edge, still pacing at night, his ears perked at every sound, his eyes following the shadows that moved outside the windows. And in the quiet moments when Ruby let her mind drift, she could still hear the men's voices, the way they had looked at her, the hatred in their eyes. She had done everything she could to prepare, to protect herself and Duke. But deep down, she knew that the danger wasn't entirely gone. She knew that those men, wherever they were, weren't the type to just give up. They would come back. And when they did, Ruby was determined to be ready. She had Duke, she had her strength, and she had the determination to fight for her home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Ruby stood by the window, her eyes scanning the street. Duke stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. "We're ready, Duke," she whispered, her voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we're ready." Duke let out a low rumble, his tail giving a slow, deliberate wag. Together, they stood in the fading light, watching, waiting, ready to defend the home they had built, the life they had fought so hard to protect. It was the middle of the night, a silence deep and thick enveloping Ruby's neighborhood, broken only by the rustling leaves and the distant hum of the occasional passing car. The kind of silence that settled just before a storm. Ruby lay in bed, a heaviness pressing down on her chest, sleep eluding her once again. Even in the warmth of her covers, she felt exposed, vulnerable. The memory of the break-in haunted her each night, replaying in vivid fragments that left her heart pounding. Duke lay in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the front door, his ears alert to every tiny creak or rustle. He had barely rested since that first attack. Despite Ruby's efforts to secure the house, the cameras, the reinforced locks, nothing seemed to ease his tension. He knew, just as Ruby did, that the threat wasn't over. His instincts told him it was only a matter of time. It happened just past midnight. The noise was faint, a soft shuffle that barely registered at first. But Duke heard it. His head snapped up, his ears perked, and his body tensed. He could hear it again, footsteps approaching the door, the hushed voices of two men. A low growl began to build in his chest, his hackles rising. He knew those voices. It was them. They had come back, Ruby stirred in her sleep, the noise pulling her from a restless dream. She sat up, blinking in the darkness, her heart pounding. There was something off. She could feel it, a tension in the air that made her chest tighten. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She could hear Duke's growl now, low and dangerous, and her heart dropped. Slowly, she moved to the hallway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Duke was already on his feet, standing rigidly near the front door, his body a wall of muscle and determination. Ruby's pulse quickened as she heard it, a soft click, the unmistakable sound of metal against metal. Someone was tampering with the lock. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. The men were back. They were trying to get in. Duke let out a deep bark, the sound echoing through the house, but it didn't deter them. The noise only grew louder, the door rattling on its hinges. Ruby felt her body go cold with fear. She had to do something. She had to protect herself and Duke. She ran to the kitchen, her mind racing. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet off the stove, her hands trembling as she clutched it tightly. She had never thought she would have to defend her home like this, but she was ready. She wasn't going to let these men take anything from her. The door burst open with a loud crash, splinters flying across the living room. Two figures rushed in, their faces obscured by dark masks. Ruby's heart leapt into her throat as she saw them, the fear she had been fighting off for days finally erupting inside her. She felt frozen, her feet unable to move, her eyes wide with terror. "Playtime's over, old lady," one of them sneered, his voice sharp, almost mocking. He held a metal rod, his posture confident, arrogant. "Did you really think you could scare us off with that mutt?" Ruby's grip on the skillet tightened, her knuckles white. She could see Duke standing between her and the intruders, his growl filling the room. He wasn't backing down. He lunged at the first man, his powerful body colliding with the intruder, knocking him back. The man stumbled, his feet tangling as he fell to the floor, Duke's teeth snapping just inches from his face. The second man, a large figure with broad shoulders, moved forward, brandishing a knife. He lunged at Duke, trying to strike him. Ruby felt her breath catch, her whole body trembling. She had to act. She couldn't just stand there. With a surge of adrenaline, Ruby ran forward, raising the skillet high above her head. She brought it down with all her strength, hitting the man on the back. He let out a grunt, stumbling forward, his knife slipping from his grasp. Duke wasted no time. He turned on the man, his jaws clamping down on his arm, his growl vibrating through the room. The first intruder scrambled to his feet, grabbing the metal rod and swinging it toward Duke. Ruby screamed, her voice cracking in desperation. Duke dodged, his body moving with a precision and speed that belied his age. He bit down on the man's leg, dragging him down once more, his growls never ceasing. Ruby's heart pounded, her hands shaking as she watched the struggle unfold before her eyes. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and rapid, the sound of the intruder's grunts, Duke's barks, the clatter of the metal rod as it hit the floor again and again. One of the men, his face twisted in pain and rage, managed to pull away. He grabbed the metal rod and swung it at Ruby, the force of the blow sending her stumbling back. She felt a sharp pain shoot through her side as she hit the wall, her breath knocked from her lungs. Duke let out a snarl, his eyes flashing as he lunged once more, knocking the man off balance, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. Ruby could hear the man scream, his voice high and panicked. She struggled to her feet, her vision blurring as she reached for the skillet, her body aching. The second man, the one with the knife, scrambled for the door, his eyes wide with fear. He had seen enough. "Diego, we need to go," he shouted, his voice frantic. The other man, Diego, struggled against Duke's hold, his eyes filled with fury. But he knew they were outmatched. He kicked at Duke, his foot connecting with the dog's side, and Duke let out a yelp, stumbling back. Ruby's heart twisted at the sound, a surge of rage coursing through her veins. She stepped forward, her voice breaking as she shouted, "Get out of my house!" The men didn't need to be told twice. They turned and bolted for the door, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. Duke barked after them, his body tense, his chest heaving with each breath. Ruby watched them disappear into the night, her whole body trembling. She dropped the skillet, the clang of metal against the floor echoing in the silence that followed. She fell to her knees beside Duke, her hands shaking as she reached out to him. He looked at her, his eyes softening, his body relaxing for the first time since the men had burst in. "Oh, Duke," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You did it. You saved us." Duke let out a soft whine, leaning into her touch, his eyes closing. Ruby wrapped her arms around him, her body shaken with sobs. She held him close, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. She knew, deep down, that she owed everything to Duke, her safety, her life. He had protected her when no one else could. The sound of sirens cut through the night, growing louder as they approached. Ruby looked up, her eyes wet with tears. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the living room, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. She could hear the footsteps of officers approaching, the heavy thud of their boots on the porch. "Ma'am? Police?" a voice called out, urgent and commanding. Ruby took a deep breath, her fingers still buried in Duke's fur. "We're here," she called back, her voice trembling. The door swung open, and two officers rushed in, their weapons drawn. They scanned the room, their eyes taking in the broken door, the splintered wood, the disarray. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, moved toward Ruby, his face softening as he saw her. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ruby nodded, her eyes filling with tears. We're okay, thanks to Duke." The officer glanced down at Duke, his expression shifting to one of awe. He knelt beside them, his hand resting on Duke's head. "You're a brave dog, you know that?" he said softly. Duke's tail gave a slow, weary wag, his eyes closing as he leaned against Ruby. The second officer moved to secure the house, speaking into his radio, calling for backup. Ruby watched them, her body still trembling, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade. She felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her limbs heavy, her head light. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing for a moment. The young officer helped her to her feet, his hand steady on her arm. "We're going to get you checked out, ma'am. Make sure you're not hurt," he said, his voice kind. He looked at Duke, who was still at her side, his body sagging with exhaustion. "And we'll get him looked at too. He's earned it." Ruby nodded, her eyes welling with tears once again. She looked down at Duke, her heart swelling with pride and love. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." The officer gave her a gentle smile, guiding her toward the door. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit Ruby's face, and she took a deep breath, her body relaxing slightly. She looked up at the sky, the stars bright against the inky blackness. It felt surreal, the events of the night playing in her mind like a distant, hazy dream. The ambulance arrived, the paramedics checking Ruby over, their hands gentle as they examined her bruises. They looked at Duke, too, giving him water, patting his head, their eyes filled with admiration. Duke stayed close to Ruby, his eyes never leaving her, even as his body swayed with fatigue. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Ruby and Duke were back inside, the house quiet once more. The door had been temporarily fixed, the broken pieces replaced, but the scars remained, both in the house and in Ruby's heart. Ruby sat on the couch, her fingers running through Duke's fur as he lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. She looked out the window, the soft glow of the morning sun filtering in, casting a golden light across the room. She took a deep breath, her heart heavy but full. "We did it, Duke," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We made it through." Duke let out a soft sigh, his eyes closing as he finally allowed himself to rest. Ruby leaned back, her eyes closing as well, her body relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. She knew there was still a long road ahead, that the fear and anxiety wouldn't just disappear overnight, but for now, in this moment, she felt safe. She had Duke, and that was enough. Morning came softly, a gentle warmth spreading through the broken house as the sun rose over the horizon. Ruby sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cradled between her hands. She had hardly slept after the events of the night before, her body aching, her mind still reeling from what had happened. She stared at the steam rising from her cup, her thoughts a jumble of exhaustion and gratitude. Duke lay beside her, his head resting on his paws, his eyes closed in an attempt to finally get some rest. Despite the exhaustion that weighed down his body, his ears flicked at every little sound, his instincts still unwilling to let their guard down completely. Ruby looked down at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions: love, gratitude, pride, and fear. Her brave dog had saved her, not once, but twice, and she knew deep down that she owed everything to him. As she sat there, lost in thought, a knock sounded at the door. Ruby startled, her heart jumping into her throat. Duke was instantly on his feet, his body tensed, his ears perked as he stood between Ruby and the door. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. "It's okay, boy," she said softly, setting her cup down and standing. She moved to the door, her hands trembling slightly as she peered through the peephole. Relief washed over her as she saw Officer Felipe, one of the officers who had been there the night before. She unlatched the door and opened it, her eyes tired but grateful. "Officer Felipe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What brings you here so early?" The officer gave her a kind smile, his eyes filled with warmth. "Good morning, Miss Ruby. I just wanted to check in, make sure you were doing okay." He glanced down at Duke, who was still standing protectively beside her, his eyes wary. "And I wanted to check on our hero here, too." Ruby smiled, her eyes misting over as she looked down at Duke. "He's tired, but we're okay, thanks to him." She opened the door wider, gesturing for the officer to come inside. Felipe stepped into the house, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the repaired door, the marks on the walls from the struggle the night before. His expression grew serious, and he turned to Ruby, his voice gentle. "It's hard to believe what you've been through, ma'am. You're lucky to have such a loyal companion." Ruby nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I am," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know what I would have done without him." Felipe knelt down, reaching out to pet Duke's head. Duke eyed him for a moment before relaxing slightly, leaning into the officer's touch. "You did good, Duke," Felipe said softly. "You protected your mom. Not many dogs would be as brave as you were." Ruby wiped at her eyes, her heart swelling with pride. Felipe stood, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. "Actually, Miss Ruby, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. I spoke to my supervisor, and we think Duke deserves some recognition for what he did. We'd like to honor him at the station, if that's okay with you." Ruby blinked, her eyes widening in surprise. "Honor him?" she repeated, her voice filled with wonder. Felipe nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, ma'am. He's a hero, and we want to make sure he gets the recognition he deserves. Our chief would like to present him with a medal. It's not every day we see bravery like that." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes, and she looked down at Duke, her heart filled with a warmth that spread through her entire body. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his head, her voice trembling. "You hear that, boy? You're going to get a medal." Duke wagged his tail slowly, his eyes softening as he looked at her. Ruby smiled, leaning down to press a kiss to his head. "You deserve it, my sweet boy. You deserve the world." That afternoon, Ruby and Duke made their way to the police station. Ruby had dressed in her best, a simple blue dress that she had worn to church on Sundays, her hair neatly combed, her heart pounding with both pride and nervousness. Duke walked beside her, his gait steady, his body moving with the grace and strength that came from years of training and loyalty. As they approached the station, Ruby could see a small crowd gathered outside, neighbors, police officers, and even a few children. They all turned as she approached, their eyes lighting up as they saw Duke. Ruby felt her chest tighten, her eyes misting over as she realized they were all here for him, to honor her brave, loyal dog. Officer Felipe met them at the entrance, a broad smile on his face. "Miss Ruby, Duke, welcome," he said warmly, gesturing for them to follow him. He led them through the crowd, the murmurs of admiration and awe following them as they made their way to the front. Ruby stood beside Duke, her heart pounding as the chief of police stepped forward, a gleaming medal in his hand. The chief, a tall man with a kind face, smiled as he looked at Duke. He raised his voice so that everyone could hear, his words carrying across the small gathering. "Today we honor a true hero," he began, his eyes on Duke. "This dog, Duke, showed incredible courage and loyalty in protecting his owner, Miss Ruby, not once but twice. It is thanks to his bravery that Miss Ruby is standing here with us today, and for that we want to recognize him for his heroic actions." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound filling the air, and Ruby felt tears slip down her cheeks. She looked down at Duke, her heart swelling with so much love and pride she thought it might burst. The chief stepped forward, kneeling in front of Duke as he placed the medal around his neck. "Duke, on behalf of the police department and this community, we thank you for your bravery," the chief said, his voice filled with emotion. Duke wagged his tail, his eyes softening as he looked at Ruby. She knelt beside him, her hands resting on his head, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You're my hero, Duke. You always will be." The crowd continued to clap, their cheers filling the air, and Ruby looked around, her eyes wet with tears. She saw familiar faces, Mrs. Alvarez from the bakery, Mr. Leonard the handyman, even a few neighbors who had never spoken to her before. They were all here, all cheering for Duke, and Ruby felt a warmth spread through her chest. After the ceremony, people came up to Ruby, offering their congratulations, their admiration for Duke. Mrs. Alvarez hugged her tightly, her eyes wet with tears. "You're so lucky, Ruby," she whispered. "That dog is a gift." Ruby nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "He is," she agreed. "He really is." Later, as the sun began to set, Ruby and Duke returned home, the metal still gleaming around Duke's neck. Ruby watched him as he walked beside her, his eyes scanning the street, his body relaxed but alert. She knew that Duke would always be there for her, always watching, always protecting, and she knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. That evening, Ruby prepared a special meal for Duke, a hearty dinner of roasted chicken, something she knew he would love. She watched as he ate, his tail wagging as he devoured the meal. She smiled, her heart swelling with love for her brave companion. When dinner was over, Ruby settled into her old armchair, Duke lying beside her, his head resting on her foot. She looked out the window, the stars twinkling in the night sky, the soft glow of the street lights casting a gentle light over the quiet neighborhood. She took a deep breath, her body relaxing, the fear that had gripped her for so long finally beginning to ease. Ruby reached down, her fingers running through Duke's fur, her voice soft as she spoke. "You know, Duke, I don't think I've ever felt as safe as I do with you by my side," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You're more than just a dog. You're my family, my hero." Duke looked up at her, his eyes filled with a warmth that made Ruby's heart swell. He let out a soft huff, his tail thumping against the floor, and Ruby smiled, her eyes misting over. She knew that no matter what happened, no matter what challenges they faced, she and Duke would be okay. They had each other, and that was enough. As the night wore on, Ruby and Duke moved to the porch, the cool night air brushing against their skin. They sat together, Ruby in her chair, Duke lying at her feet, the metal still gleaming around his neck. They watched the stars, the quiet of the night settling over them like a comforting blanket. Ruby closed her eyes, her heart filled with gratitude and love. With Duke by her side, she knew she could face anything. And as they sat there, under the endless expanse of the night sky, Ruby felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. A peace that came from knowing she was not alone, that she was protected, that she was loved. "My dear Duke," she whispered, her voice carried away by the soft breeze, "with you here, I know nothing will ever shake us. We are unstoppable." And in that moment, as they sat together, the weight of the past weeks slowly lifting, Ruby knew that they had truly found their new dawn, a fresh start, a new beginning, filled with hope, love, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog. The darkness had come, and it had tested them, but together they had faced it, and together they had won. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming videos. There's more to come, and we'd love to have you along. Feel free to check out our other stories for more gripping moments, and if this one moved you, share it with your friends. Let's keep these tales alive together.